the blizzard of 1844 that killed 30 trained soldiers, but not a single mountain man. In late February of 1844, a buckskin-clad trapper named Old Bill Williams was breaking trail along the South Pass of the Wind River Range in what is now Wyoming. He was looking for a string of beaver traps he had set before the storm. He found something else instead. He found a row of canvas wall tents, half buried in drifted snow, with rifles still stacked in neat tripods outside the doors. Inside the tents were 30 men of the United States Army 1st Dragoons. Every one of them was frozen solid. Some were sitting upright. One was still holding a pen. The wood inside their stoves had not been lit in at least 10 days. Old Bill counted the bodies twice. Then he found the 31st man, the one who was still breathing, barely, in the command tent. The lieutenant could not speak. He could not remember his own name. He could not stop shaking. It would be 9 days before he said a single word. And what he eventually said is the only reason we have this story at all. 4 miles away, in the same valley, in the same blizzard, 5 mountain men had also wintered through that storm. 5 unwashed, unshaven, unschooled trappers in a half-buried elk hide lodge. Every one of them walked out alive. They did not lose a finger. They did not lose a toe. They barely noticed the storm at all. This is the story of how the United States Army learned the hard way that the men they considered savages were the only people on the continent who actually knew how to survive a high plains winter. To understand what happened in that valley, you have to understand who the soldiers were and why they were there in the first place. The detachment was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Hiram Beckwith, a West Point graduate who had served in the Seminole campaigns in Florida. His orders had come down from Fort Leavenworth in October of 1843, map the Sweetwater Pass, identify suitable forage sites for the spring migration, establish a forward winter camp to demonstrate Army presence in the territory. Beckwith had 30 enlisted men, 2 pack mules per soldier, full Army-issue winter kit, and a copy of the United States Cavalry Field Manual that had been written, almost word for word, from a French translation of a Prussian winter doctrine published in 1809. The manual told him to build a wall tent encampment. The manual told him to dig a perimeter trench. The manual told him to maintain a 2-hour watch rotation through the night. The manual did not mention that European winters and Wyoming winters are not the same kind of winter. Beckwith's men were professionals. They had served together for years. They had marched across the southern plains in summer heat that killed lesser units. They were brave, they were disciplined, and they did exactly what they had been training to do. That, in the end, is what killed them. The mountain men in the next valley were not professionals at anything. They were not soldiers. They were not part of any organization. They worked very loosely for the American Fur Company, but in 1844 the beaver trade was already dying and most of them were trapping on their own account. There were 5 of them in that lodge. Jim Baker, who would later become one of the most famous frontiersmen of the American West, Old Bill Williams, the only one history bothered to remember by his full name, and 3 others whose names are recorded only as Pierre, the Tennessean, and young Antoine. Between them, those 5 men had something the United States Army did not have. They had close to 100 combined winters of experience in those mountains, and every single one of those winters had been spent learning firsthand from the Crow, the Shoshone, the Arapaho, and the Lakota. The trappers had been adopted into bands. They had married into families. They had buried Indian wives and Indian children. They had spent 20 years absorbing knowledge that the tribes had been refining for 10,000 years. The Army Manual was 35 years old. The mountain men's curriculum was older than the Bronze Age. The storm rolled in on the night of January 14, 1844. The trappers smelled it coming 3 days out. Old Bill Williams later said the air had gone thin and sweet, the way it does before the cold lays down. The sky to the northwest had a particular flat, gray sheen. The horses got restless. The chickadees stopped singing. By the time the first flakes fell, the trappers had already cut and stacked enough firewood for 6 weeks, butchered a fresh elk, and rebanked the snow walls around their lodge. 4 miles east, the soldiers were finishing their evening parade. The temperature dropped from 28 degrees above zero to 36 degrees below zero in less than 4 hours. The wind came in from the high country at sustained speeds that men who survived later compared to a freight train. 6 feet of fresh snow fell in the first night. By morning, the dragoons' wall tents, which were designed for autumn maneuvers in Pennsylvania, were sagging under loads of wet snow that no canvas was ever meant to carry. This was the moment everything began to go wrong. The wool uniforms the soldiers wore were the best uniforms the United States Army could issue in 1844. They were warm, they were sturdy, and they were absolutely useless in a Wyoming blizzard. Wet wool freezes. The men had been sweating through their morning duties. By noon on the second day, every uniform in the camp was a sheet of ice that crackled when the men moved. The army boots, made of stiff leather, did the same thing. Frostbite started in the toes within hours. By the third day, men were losing feeling in their hands. Beckwith ordered firewood rationed. He had been trained to ration wood. The manual said an encampment of 30 men needed 80 pounds of wood per 24-hour cycle. The manual was written for Belgium. In a Wyoming cold snap, 80 pounds of wood will keep one man alive, not 30. Beckwith did not know this. Nobody in the United States Army knew this in 1844. He also ordered the men to stay in their tents and maintain unit cohesion. Movement, the manual said, leads to fatigue, and fatigue leads to death. So the men sat in their frozen uniforms, in their unheated tents, in temperatures dropping to 45 degrees below zero at night, trying to follow orders given by a manual translated from a language none of them spoke. By day 6, 3 soldiers were dead. By day 9, 11 were dead. The frostbite had turned to gangrene. The gangrene had turned to sepsis. The men who were still alive could no longer feel their feet. Some could no longer move their arms. The lieutenant later described it in his 9 days after the fact testimony as watching his command freeze in place like a chess set someone forgot in the snow. 4 miles away, the trappers were doing fine. Their lodge was not a tent. It was a half-buried structure dug 3 feet into the earth, walled with stacked deadfall, and roofed with 12 overlapping elk hides that had been smoked and rendered to a leather as tough as oak. The entrance was a tunnel, not a doorway, which meant the wind could not blow directly into the living space. The interior was insulated with the buffalo robes lining the walls and the floor. Snow drifted around the lodge and over it, and the snow itself became part of the insulation. By the 3rd day of the storm, the lodge was almost invisible. To anyone looking down from a ridge, it was just another mound of white in a valley of white. Inside, it was 62 degrees. The trappers cooked over a small fire of dried buffalo chips and pine needles. Buffalo chips burned slow, hot, and almost smokeless, which the tribes had figured out approximately 8,000 years before the Roman Empire existed. The smoke that did rise went out through a single small vent at the top of the lodge, a vent the men could open or close depending on the wind. They were not breathing in their own carbon monoxide. They were not freezing. They were not, in any meaningful sense, suffering. They ate constantly. Pemmican, which is dried meat pounded into powder and mixed with rendered fat and dried berries, is the most calorie-dense food a human being can carry. The trappers each consumed roughly 6,000 calories a day during the storm. They knew, because the Crow had taught them, that in extreme cold, the body burns fuel at a rate that civilians cannot imagine. A man who eats 3,000 calories at 40 below is starving. A man who eats 6,000 is comfortable. Beckwith's men, on army rations, were eating about 2,200. At night, the trappers slept naked. This sounds insane. It is not insane. Wet clothes against the skin in a sleeping robe will pull heat out of the body for 8 hours. Bare skin between 2 layers of buffalo fur traps a layer of dry, warm air that stays warm all night. The Indians had figured this out in the late Pleistocene. The trappers had been told by men, whose grandfathers had been told by men, whose grandfathers had hunted mammoths. The United States Army Field Manual recommended sleeping in full uniform, with boots on, ready for muster. On day 6 of the storm, something happened that the lieutenant remembered very clearly when he could finally speak. A figure appeared on the ridge above the soldiers' camp. Wrapped in a buffalo robe, carrying a long rifle, the figure raised one hand. Beckwith, who could still walk at that point, walked out to meet him. It was Old Bill Williams. Old Bill had smelled the soldiers' fire 2 days earlier and tracked it back. He understood immediately what he was looking at. He told Beckwith, in plain English, that his men were going to die. He offered to lead them that day, that hour, to the trappers' lodge. He said there was room. He said there was meat. He said the storm was going to last another 2 weeks, and the soldiers would not see another sunrise after the next 4 days. Beckwith refused. He refused for reasons that, in 1844, were perfectly logical to a West Point officer. He refused because Old Bill was a civilian and had no authority over a military encampment. He refused because the manual said an organized camp must not abandon its position. He refused because the lodge of 5 unwashed trappers was not a proper shelter under regulation. He refused because to accept the help of a man like Old Bill Williams was, in the social and military framework of 1844, beneath the dignity of an officer of the United States Army. He thanked Old Bill. He sent him away. He went back to his tent. He sat down at his small folding desk, and he wrote a letter to his wife. That letter was found in his hand, frozen 12 days later. It was the lieutenant who survived. Beckwith was not the survivor. Beckwith died on day 19, still trying to follow his manual to the last paragraph. The lieutenant who lived was a young man named Charles Fremont. Not the famous Fremont, a different one, a junior officer who had been on his first command. He survived because on day 14, when he was the last man still moving, he crawled out of the camp into the snow and started walking in the direction Old Bill had pointed. He made it about 1.5 miles before he collapsed. The trappers found him on day 15. They carried him back. They thawed him slowly in stages, the way the Shoshone had taught them, packing his hands and feet in cool water before warm water, never near the fire, never wrapped tight. He kept all his fingers, he kept all his toes. 9 days after the storm finally broke, he could speak. He said, "Why didn't we know any of this?" It is a question the United States Army did not want answered. The official report on the Beckwith disaster, filed in Fort Leavenworth in the summer of 1844, blamed the weather. It described the storm as an act of providence beyond the capacity of any military preparation to withstand. It did not mention Old Bill Williams. It did not mention the offer of shelter. It did not mention the Trappers' Lodge 4 miles away, where every man was warm, fed, and rested. The report was filed, sealed, and forgotten. The bodies were buried. The widows were paid. The Dragoon Detachment was reformed under a new commander. The story did not appear in any history book until 1923, when a graduate student at the University of Wyoming named Alma Shaw found Fremont's personal letters in the back of a county archive in Casper. He had written everything down. He had named Old Bill. He had named Jim Baker. He had named the Tennessean and Pierre and young Antoine. He had recorded in 20 pages of careful handwriting exactly how 5 men with no formal education had survived a storm that killed 30 professional soldiers, and exactly how the Army had buried that fact for 80 years. Fremont's letters do something else too. They include a list. It is a list of every piece of knowledge he learned in those 10 days inside the Trapper's Lodge: how to read the sky, how to bank a snow wall, how to build a vapor barrier with smoked elk hide, how to render fat for fuel, how to track elk in a whiteout, how to recognize the early signs of frostbite by smell, not sight, how to thaw a frozen man without killing him, how to sleep, eat, walk, and breathe at 40 below zero. Every item on that list was knowledge that in 1844 was being held by men the United States government considered an obstacle to civilization. The same year that 30 soldiers froze to death following a Prussian field manual, the men in the next valley over were sitting on a survival library that had taken 10,000 years to compile. And the official policy of the federal government in 1844 was that those men and the people who had taught them were going to be moved, removed, or killed within a generation. Most of them were. Old Bill Williams was killed by Ute warriors 5 years later in 1849 in the San Juan Mountains. Jim Baker died in 1898 on a small ranch in Wyoming, almost forgotten. The Tennessean and Pierre and young Antoine disappear from the records entirely. Their lodge, somewhere in that valley below the Wind River Range, fell apart and went back to the earth, and nobody can find the spot anymore. Fremont resigned his commission in 1851. He spent the rest of his life writing about the trappers. Almost nobody read what he wrote. The blizzard of 1844 is not in the textbooks. It is barely in the archives. It is one of hundreds of frontier disasters that the Army quietly cleaned up and walked away from. But it is one of the few where the documentation survives, where the names are recorded, where you can stand on the ridge above where Beckwith's camp used to be and look 4 miles west and know exactly where 5 men who could not read or write held onto every piece of knowledge the soldiers needed and were never taught. The men we called savages knew how to live in that country. The men we called civilized did not. And the difference between the two valleys on those 19 days in January and February of 1844 was not bravery, it was not discipline, it was not equipment, it was not even luck, it was knowledge. The kind of knowledge that takes 10,000 years to gather and 1 generation to lose. If this is the kind of frontier history you want more of, subscribe. There are dozens of stories like this one, buried in archives, waiting for someone to dig them up. We dig them up every week.